Chris, thank you so much for the time. How you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on, Trey.
It is my pleasure, and I've been looking forward to this conversation as somebody who takes a lot of pride in the interviews that I get to conduct. So to get to speak with somebody who's one of the best in the business is really cool. But this book is about a whole lot more than just your interview skills, Chris. When did you decide to write this book, and what was the process like of actually getting to this finished product here?
Well, I've been approached about stories. People would see me and say, "Hey, and we, covered the Super Bowl and the World Series and with Brady and this, that. But what about Mike Tyson almost beat you up, or you were at the Earthquake World Series, or you were at the Olympics when the bomb went off, and you reported on all these things, and it became much more than just sports." The O.J. Simpson, the first live interview with him after both trials. So I was approached, and I really, I'm still working here, so I didn't have a lot of time for a book. But when they said, you got all these things, and if we put them together, we think people would be interested. So I started keeping notes back in things nobody wants to hear about the pandemic, but back then we all had a lot of time. And so I was working, putting it together. And then they said, "Hey, let's go. Let's put it together." And so it's out, this month. Perfect time for Christmas. It's really more than a sports book, but if you're a sports fan, you'll love it. And you're a fan of interviews, there's some of that in there about how I learned about interviewing and technique, and some of the people that I've experienced and gotten advice from through the years. So it's also a good broadcast book, a good media book too, from that standpoint.
Yeah, I agreed with all of that. And I love stories of people who have made a name for themselves in entertainment who actually get their start in radio. And sure enough, that's how you got your start. You and I are actually very similar in that when our friends were concerned with the next cool music, we were actually tuning into our local sports radio station. Me, the ticket in Dallas, and you, a sports radio station in Miami. So how did you actually get your start in radio, Chris?
Yeah, it was WKAT with a K. 5,000 watt Miami Beach station, and I lived in Florida, but would call in there on the 2 hours sports show that night, News Talk, and they were supposed to only call once a night or once a week, and I would call as Chris from Miami and then disguise my voice and call back Duke from North Miami, and they didn't have caller ID, and so I would agree with my earlier call, and I wasn't trying to fool anybody, except I just wanted to get on the air more and talk more sports. And so that was 13, 14, and so they invited me down there one time with fans that call in, and I had to tell them. My dad drove me down there and said, "You gotta face the music, kid. Tell them the truth." I thought they'd be angry and tell me to beat it, but they said, "Hey, if you want a part-time job here on weekends or something." So when I got my license, that's kind of how I did it behind the scenes. And then eventually got to fill in and then become the sports director, and then work my way through college to get onto television. So I don't know if that worked today, but it worked for me at the time. And it really was driven by my passion for talking sports and interviewing people. And it served me well since.
And needless to say, you as an interviewer, well, you were cutting your chops with some pretty big names even early on. How did Muhammad Ali help to provide a sort of passion for speaking with other people?
Yeah, that was the first interview I did, which 16, leaving my humanities class, having to drive over to the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach. He was having a press conference. He trained down there at the Fifth Street Gym, and I was, 60 at the time, but the sports director couldn't make it. So it was a last minute, "Hey, kid, we need you to get over there." And I really wasn't even on the air yet, but he said, "Just, put the microphone in there, ask a few questions, and we'll get it on the air." And walking into the room, he, obviously the charisma, the outstanding fighter, he's the greatest, but he was nice to me. I was nervous amongst, seasoned journalists and sports writers, and asked him some questions about the fight and the opponent. And he had a sense of humor. I mean, I had long hair and this big, microphone with the big recording device. Tape recorder, we called it. They still have, anyway, he said, "You're not as dumb as you look, kid." He went on to answer the question. So it was kind of after that, I thought, well, I could interview the greatest. Hopefully I could interview a lot of people. But the theme through most of, when I've done broadcasting, whether it's Super Bowls, World Series, celebrities, I did try, and I saw this in a movie and it stuck with me to treat the star like a regular guy. And when you run into regular people, treat them like a star. And I think that is what people appreciate, feel comfortable, and they're more forthcoming and willing to have a conversation with you and answer questions honestly.
Yeah, treating them like people is a big deal because they are people. Now, that's not to say you were never nervous. Interestingly, the most nervous you maybe ever were talking to somebody didn't involve a microphone in your hand. It had to do with a love that you had for comedy and stand-up comedy. And you had the chance to go up and tell Johnny Carson how much he meant to you during your days at ESPN. Johnny had a very prickly reputation when the cameras weren't rolling. So how did that interaction go for you?
Yeah, and I was nervous because he was my idol. I had a lot of sports idols as a kid, and later got to interview them, whether it was John Elway or Montana or Mahomes or Brett Favre or whomever. And in baseball, certainly whether it was Steve Garvey or you can just go through the list of different people, golfers like Jack Nicklaus and Tiger, Michael Jordan and Kobe and Wilt Chamberlain, if we go back, and who had a book out himself. But this was one, when I was a kid with sports, before I even fell in love with sports, stay up late, used to kind of watch his monologue and repeat it, that type of thing. But loved the way he interviewed people. He made them feel comfortable, whether it was a celebrity star or some person from Georgia who liked to make potato chips in the shape of animals. Or he just had a way of knowing when to move the interview, when to take it over, when to let them go, just like with comedians, giving them their start. So anyway, we're doing the late night Sportscenter. Had 10 years during the growth years at ESPN. Worked a variety of different positions there, but I'm doing the 2 a.m. Eastern, which was the West Coast Sports Center. Linda Cohn was a partner for a while, Mike Tirico. So Tirico was up this time, and we had some time to fill at that hour of the morning as we wrap up the show, and Mike would throw in a nugget. He always had some kind of sports fact beyond what we were studying or had in the show. And I was a Carson fan, and so I just picked up automatically in my conversation. This is how most of your catchphrases go. When you hear something, you repeat it. So he would say, "Hey, you know this about this team?" And I would say, I did not know that. It's kind of, so they loved this segment. And the producer, they said, "Hey, let's plan this at every show." And we'll call it "Did You Know?" And they had "Did You Know" T-shirts, and I think they had a sponsor, "Did You Know?" with the planned sports facts. So anyway, years later, I'm out in California, and there's a tennis tournament going on. Johnny Carson, the king of late night. For those that don't know, he's not Carson Daly. This is Johnny Carson, and he's stepping away from the biz, but he enjoyed tennis. Was a big tennis fan. I knew he would watch some of the stuff that we had on tennis highlights during the day. So anyway, I'm just got a press pass. I'm just hanging out. I'm not really working this event, but Carson is there. He's in a little area privately, just minding his own business. And so I'm like, this is my one chance. I'm not interviewing him. I hate to bother him. I know how people are sensitive to that. I respect that, but gosh, anyway. So I slide over there and I wait in between the action, and I walk up to Carson, and there's more of this in the book, but I'll run through it. I just basically say, "Hey, excuse me, Mr. Carson, I hate to interrupt. I'm Chris Myers." And he said, I know who you are. And I said, well, I just wanted you to know, obviously I'm a fan of you, watching you for years, but the SportsCenter segment on ESPN, "Did you know?" that came from your line of "I did not know that." And I used to use it, and people. So it's really out of respect to you that we have that segment. And he paused and he looked at me and he said, I did not know that. And then he walked away. And so that was my big moment. But I was nervous for that one. More nervous there than interviewing O.J. Simpson or going face to face with Mike Tyson when he wanted to punch me in the face for asking about Evander Holyfield's ear. But those are the kinds of stories that I've been able to enjoy through 20 plus years at Fox and then that 10-year run at ESPN.
Yeah, and you go in great depth on the OJ and Tyson stories, and may ask you a little bit about that later on. First, though, you just mentioned you and Tirico doing SportsCenter. That was obviously when Dan Patrick and Keith Olbermann were there. Linda Cohn, Craig Kilborn was there at a certain point. That really was the heyday for SportsCenter. I was a teenager throughout the 1990s, so I was in that category of people who may be watching SportsCenter at 10 or 11, and then I'm probably, assuming that I'm not at school or maybe I'm skipping that day, I probably have ESPN on from 7 a.m. all the way until noon when you guys go with fresher programming. What was it like to be a part of something so instrumental in shaping the lives of sports fans everywhere in this country?
Yeah, no, it was a special time and a special place, and it was the only game in town. And I'm really fortunate. It's funny how timing, just like dropping in, being in these other situations that I talk about in the book, that I was at, ESPN was around long before I got there. Not long, but obviously 8 or 9 years. But when I got there, it was the real growth years. And then also when I went over to Fox Sports in start of 2000, that was also the growth stretch of Fox Sports. They had the NFL, but then they got baseball, then they got NASCAR, and they kept adding all these sports. So that's a great time to be at a place when they're building and you get opportunities to do things. So that time was special because we had a lot of fun at ESPN. We all cared about, and we didn't have to get, when you do local sports or on other stations, you got squeezed for time when there were emergencies, which is understandable, or weather issues or things like that. But this was 24-hour sports, and we still covered news when they related to sports, as I found out. But we hung out, and we talked about games, we watched games, and it's something we'd be doing if we weren't getting paid for it. And so many great people behind the scenes, too, with creative ideas. And we were really allowed to kind of shape things the way we want. We wrote our own material. Youngsters out of college would help us with a shot sheet, and we would ad lib on things and the interaction, and some really fine people that you work with through the years. And Chris Berman was another one. Berman and Bob Lee were the face, the pillars of ESPN that took it forward. Then they expanded and things happened. So I really thought I'd be there for 20 or 30 years, but other opportunities came knocking when I did the up close interview show for ESPN, taking over for Roy Firestone. But I'm really grateful for that time. It was some of the most fun I had in the business, and helped pave the way for other things that I wanted to do beyond that.
Interviewed damn near everybody throughout your career, and you're obviously really good at it as well. What do you think the key to interviewing is, Chris?
Well, I think I touched on a couple of things. Treating somebody, even if you're intimidated by them a little bit, or you're obviously impressed with their skill, their ability, but you really have to talk to them as a person, respectfully. And even if you have to ask a tough question, producer called me the Velvet Hammer, because I was sensitive when even asking a tough question. And you got to know what kind of interview you're doing. Is it a sit down? You're inviting somebody on a show for a lengthy interview. Then you can't be like 60 minutes and grilling them. But if it's a quick post game, pre game, if it's a newsy kind of interview, but I think most people really respect if you do your homework and research, if you have an idea where you're going, if you listen. Obviously, that's the key, is listening to their answer and playing off of that. I always found that usually, if you really want to, there's got to be a follow up to the question that you really want information on, and you'll get much more out of it. But most of all is that idea that I touched on from Carson, and there's some great interviews. Howard Stern, Barbara Walters. I mean, there's different styles that people have over the years for different subjects. But I think the people part of it, and coming from a big family, and being in situations as a youngster growing up that maybe weren't expected or awkward, seeing how I reacted, how people reacted, what was right, what wasn't right, or what I didn't feel good about, helped shape later. And I think it helped shape all of us when we do these interviews. So to just headline it, it's treat people like a person that you're talking to and care about, but know what you want to cover with them and really listen to their responses. Also, sometimes you'll have to take the lead on it. You'll use a little sense of humor. You might throw out a fact, something that gets them a little bit more comfortable. But that comfort part and real conversation is what makes it.
Yeah, that comfort, that humor, it allows you to ask the difficult questions because you are disarming when you do those things. And when you do ask something difficult, you're not doing so from a stance of trying to attack that person necessarily. There are exceptions, of course. O.J. Simpson comes to mind, but you're not necessarily trying to harm that person, but it is important to ask the questions that everybody is wondering most about. And
yes,
there is definitely a skill to that because not everybody can do it.
Well, and I think you have to also listen. And if somebody does not want to answer the question, and you've tried a couple of different ways respectfully, then you have to respect that. If somebody just says, you know what, I'm uncomfortable answering that. Okay, I get it. That's unfair. We'll move on. I mean, at least we did our part to ask. And you're right. You got to think, I left that out. That's the most important part. I take it for granted. When you're interviewing somebody, is you really do, I do, consider, who's watching, right? The viewer. What do they want to know? What do they want to ask? I mean, that's part of the preparation. But yes, you have to respect people's turf and space when they're straightforward with you.
What's the hardest question you ever had to ask?
Well, I mean, the awkward one was O.J. Simpson about, are you capable of killing, or did you, have any involvement in the double murders? I mean, in that live situation, you just don't know how he's going to respond.
And for context for people, you were literally the first interview for O.J. after the not guilty verdict, and then he was found He was found culpable in the civil trial. So you were the
Right.
very first person to speak with him after that.
Yeah, the wrongful death lawsuit where he didn't take the stand. So in obviously we all watched the trial of the century with this guy. So when he wanted to come on up close, his conditions were it had to be live, and that I couldn't ask about his kids. But other than that, I said, I can't be talking football here. There's a lot of things I want to ask you about. So it's a sports show, but this was a once in a lifetime opportunity for people to kind of answer questions on the fly. And in preparation, I had great access. I mean, I saw pictures that even the jury didn't see from the investigation. I talked to police. I talked to psychologists about the way, he had turned down a Barbara Walters interview because she would only tape it. He didn't want, if it was taped, he thought people would edit it and make him look guilty. He believed in his own live, responses or answers to questions that he could spin as my view of it and convince people that he was innocent and he's really a good guy. And I wanted to, just going back to what we talk about interviewing style, I wanted him to be comfortable and answer questions. But it was difficult because the research pointed to guilt. So I didn't want to be the prosecutor or the judge or the jury. I just wanted to be the guy asking those questions and let people judge for themselves. It was supposed to be a half hour live on Up Close. We ended up rolling 45 or 50 minutes with commercials. I forget the exact time, which was good because they made the decision to give us that opportunity to continue with the interview. And he's the only guest where I never really shook his hand afterwards. I just thanked him for coming on. In fact, we thought that he may not even show up. Some people told me I shouldn't do the interview because, in fact, his own attorney, one of his own attorneys, and you'll see this in the book, who defended him, said, Chris, I'd stay away from that. He's, anybody affected with him is negative, bad news, could hurt your career. But it was something, actually, Bill Murray, who I'm friends with over the years, that Bill Murray, said, no, you got to do this. It's your job. You have this opportunity. And he recommended a book I read to prepare myself for somebody who's kind of spinning stories and to stay on track and do it respectfully. And it helped.
Yeah, you share a number of stories involving Bill Murray, a lot of humor, a lot of love for sports too, and he also has a lot of compassion, of course. People think of some of the randomness with Bill Murray over time, showing up at random places and washing dishes or doing a kegger at a frat party. Your random Bill Murray story is fascinating, though, because it does involve that compassion having to do with something that I'm guessing was the most difficult part of this book to write, and that is your son passing away tragically, dying tragically in a car accident more than a decade ago. First off, I'm very sorry for your loss, even if it was more than a decade ago. But how did Bill Murray show his incredible sense of humor in a time of such sadness for y'all at the end of a lunch of all things?
Yeah, he met my son and talked to my son Christopher, and it was difficult to write about, Trey, and difficult to talk about, but I bring that up in the book because I covered some stories that related to the loss of life. Dale Earnhardt, and of course his son who drives, Dale Earnhardt Jr. There was also a situation, a young basketball player at Loyola Marymount, Hank Gathers, who was projected to be a number one pick at age 19, same age as my son, who collapsed on a court playing in a tournament game. And then later I had to cover that story at the hospital where he was pronounced dead. So, but I wanted people to know in their darkest hour, in these difficult spots, that there are people out there that help, and you don't know where or how it's coming from, but they're there, and it's worth remembering that, even when it seems like you're questioning everything and you doubt even maybe your own existence, your purpose. But Bill Murray, who had been a friend, he couldn't make the funeral for my son. His brothers did and sent some nice things. But a couple of weeks later, said he was in town and said he wanted to come up to the house with my youngest son. And said, hey, just, I'll take you guys out. Let's get a break. And Bill comes from a big family like I do. We'd become friends since the 90s at the ESPYs and had gone to a baseball game, played some golf. But I knew his brothers. We stayed in touch. I played in his charity event. He just wanted to, I guess, be there and didn't have to say a whole lot. But he certainly was good that way. We went out to eat lunch, and then afterwards, this is Bill Murray. You don't know what to expect. He did finish half of his sandwich, whatever it was, corned beef, I forget. But anyway, it's in the book. He wraps it up, and as we're driving back to the house, he says, "Hey, who of your friends and neighbors," he asked me, "who would want this? We don't want to go to waste." I'm like, "Well, Bill, I don't even know who's home with it." But I mentioned a family of ours that my sons went to school with around the corner. I said the Delgados, said hopefully they'd be home, but they're nice people. So he said, let's drop this off. And I realized, so I pull up, and it was a really humorous moment at kind of a sad time. But anyway, yeah, we ring the doorbell. He comes to the door. He's like, "Hey, I'm with the Myers, and we just, we didn't finish this sandwich. If you want to eat it, we're dropping it off." And the woman there was stunned, and I think her daughter was home or whatever. And so he said hi and hello, and then we went on from there. There's more of those kinds of stories with Bill Murray, and some of them are very serious in terms of what his observations are and recommendations. We don't agree on everything, but it just showed a sign of a guy who you would like him even if he wasn't the famous Bill Murray. And his brothers are like that too. They're not as famous, but they're just the same kind of people, good people. And so I'm grateful for that relationship. It was nice of him to write the foreword. I hate leaning on people for those kinds of favors, but but he said, no, I'd be glad to do it. It took him a while. Bill, you got to track him down, but he did it, and he writes from the heart. It's all him, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, if you've got the 800 number, then you at least have a chance, right?
Yeah, no, well, now he has another number, which is good too. So that's direct, and he texts now because of his kids, which is a good thing. That's a good way to reach him as well.
Very nice. Well, we were out of time, unfortunately, because I was running about 10 minutes late. But man, what an incredible book this is. It is filled with stories that show that Chris Myers has one of those Forrest Gumpian sort of existences when it comes to covering sports. The book is a good one. That Deserves a Wow is the title. Chris Myers is my guest. Chris, thank you so much for the time today. It's been a real honor and pleasure, and best of luck with things in the future.
Yeah, no, thank you. And by the way, yeah, Forrest Gump, it is like the movie Forrest Gump or Almost Famous. Remember the one, Cameron Crowe, about the young rock and roll? But if you put sports around it, it has a little bit of that feel. Well, thanks for your time, and I really appreciate you having me on and talking to you, Trey.
If you're still watching or listening on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or elsewhere, I would greatly appreciate you subscribing to this show, and please do like today's episode. Thanks to Gentleman Jesus for the intro and outro music. Hear more of his work at gentlemanjesus.com. Thanks to you for hanging out. For more of the show and to connect on social media, visit booksonpod.com. We'll talk to you next time on Books on Pod.